Hello and welcome to the TID Water and Power Podcast. I'm your host, Constance Anderson, and on this month's episode, we're taking a look behind the scenes of the podcast. As we round out the year, we thought it would be fun to take a look back at what is now more than 2.5 years of the TID Water and Power Podcast. Maybe you're a new listener, or maybe you've been with us since episode 1. Either way, we hope you enjoy learning a little bit more about how the TID Water and Power Podcast is created, recorded, and delivered to you each month. On this episode, I'm joined by TID Communications Specialist Brandon McMillan to discuss the origin of the podcast, talk about what goes into releasing each episode, and take a look back at some of our favorite moments on the podcast. Brandon, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
It's fun to have you on this side of the microphone instead of hiding behind the soundboard. While this is your first appearance as a guest, you're certainly no stranger to the podcast. But would you start by telling our listeners a little bit about your background with the district and your role specifically on the TID Water and Power Podcast?
Absolutely. So I joined the district in 2015 as a communication specialist. At the time, that position was called a public information specialist. Prior to the district, I was a local reporter covering breaking news and government here in the Turlock area. Much like my title and the division as a whole, my job has changed over the kind of 8+ years I've been with the district. Now I largely focus on digital communication. This includes social media, our website, and one large digital avenue is this podcast, which I serve as the producer and editor of the podcast.
Right on.
But you've now asked that question in various different ways to 39 unique guests on the podcast. So while our listeners may know you as the host, Constance Anderson, they may not know anything else about you. So I'm going to flip the script and ask you to tell our listeners about your background with the district.
Oh, okay. Well, I joined the district in March of 2018 as the Communications Division Manager. And in that role, I lead the internal and external communications efforts for TID. So prior to coming to the district, I actually worked in event planning, which is very much a behind-the-scenes sort of role and very different than the public forward-facing role that we have in communications. But event planning and communications are similar in the sense that if you're doing your job right, everything just kind of flawlessly happens and nobody really thinks about the people that are making it happen, which is kind of similar to what we do in communications in that we hope we're getting the right message to the right audience and that's just kind of happening in a natural, organic sort of way. Kind of like this podcast. We hope that it's informative and educational, but also entertaining and enjoyable to listen to. So this is episode 32 of the podcast, which is hard to believe. Where did the idea to start a podcast come from?
So the original idea for the podcast came from our general manager, Michelle Reimers. She had mentioned the idea of doing a TID-focused podcast to our board of directors. Once that idea kind of trickled down the way and made its way to the communications division, who was tasked with exploring the concepts of a TID podcast a little deeper. This included what format the podcast would take, how often we would release episodes, and how we would even produce a podcast.
Right.
So this idea came about kind of late 2019, early 2020. And then we spent the majority of 2020 researching and planning for what the TID Water and Power Podcast would become. At the end of 2020, we built this small little cozy studio that we're in right now. And then we did some recording tests, some interview tests between you and I to kind of get settled before recording that first episode. But I don't think we've talked about this at all. What did you think of kind of the idea of a TID podcast when Michelle first brought it up to us?
I thought it was awesome. Truly. It's another way for us to share what goes on at the district, but also another opportunity to kind of meet people where they are. You know, some people love reading newsletters. Some people love, their own different forms of media. So I thought that having a podcast out there as another option to reach out to people was a great idea. A little intimidating, but a great idea.
And on that intimidation factor, how did it feel when I recommended you to be the host of the podcast?
I was honored, certainly. And I will say that, again, while it was a little bit intimidating, it has been a lot of fun. I'm really enjoying it.
I couldn't agree more.
All right. Now, I want to backtrack to something you said. We built our studio at the end of 2020. Maybe we need to explain a little bit that we're kind of using the word build loosely.
A build is very loosely. It involved a lot of working with our construction and maintenance staff to clear out an old records room. And by records, I mean like archival records, not vinyl records. But it's really about an 8-foot by 8-foot or so studio. And it got a little bit of paint and some borrowed furniture from elsewhere in the basement. And then we did a little bit of kind of acoustic treating to, help with the sound down here. And that's kind of the studio we have now.
All right. So what was the first episode of the podcast and when was it released?
So the first episode was actually an interview with our general manager, Michelle Reimers, kind of creating that full circle moment. It was discussing the challenges of 2020, which were big challenges. We can all recall. And then the projects the district was working on at the time, and then to look ahead to the rest of 2021 and what that was going to bring. Michelle had just at that point been the general manager for about a year and a half. So it was a really great opportunity for her for the first time to really share her kind of what her goals were, what priorities the district was working on at the time, kind of through that kind of year and a half mark. And then that episode was released on May 12th of 2021. Again, about a year and a half from that original podcast idea. Okay.
So certainly there are no shortage of podcasts out there these days, and they're all kind of done with varying levels of formality. But I'd like to share with our listeners how we create the TID Water and Power Podcast. Can you tell us a little bit more about how we actually go through the process of recording, producing, and releasing our podcast?
Yeah, so the TID Water Power Podcast is completely produced in-house by TID staff. This means we prepare our outlines, record, edit, mix, and master each of our episodes entirely with TID staff. We found that this is not only pretty unique for a team of our size, but especially within the utility industry, as we've talked to kind of our counterparts at other utilities who may have a podcast. We were in the unique position to have a staff with the skill set to be able to do a podcast like this in-house.
And I'd like to clarify that the staff with that skill set is you. So thank you very much for that.
It's very much a team effort, I will say. But we very much knew that doing this project in-house would be much cheaper over the long run than having to farm this out or bring in a consultant to produce a monthly podcast for us. Overall staff time, and again, I said this is a team effort. Staff time is usually about 34 hours per month across the board. This includes brainstorming, development meetings, research, but then a large amount of time goes to recording and editing, mixing and mastering, like I mentioned. There's a lot of different hands that kind of help a podcast go from kind of an idea all the way to being released to your phone or your car, wherever you're listening to it. So a lot of our external affairs team, plays a big role in us producing this podcast each month.
Awesome. And we've covered a wide variety of topics on the podcast. Tell us about how those topics get selected.
So we'll roughly map out an entire year worth of topics for the podcast. So right now, as we prep for the end of the year, we're looking at 2024. So what does next year look like? We'll map out topics that are focused on what's interesting to our customers or listeners, what's important for our customers to know about the district, what important news, what happenings, etc. So we try to tie those topics to what's important, and then we apply a timeliness to it too. So we're not going to talk about the irrigation season and all the facets of that in the middle of winter when it's the irrigation off season. We're going to focus some timeliness to when the topics are important. So I think a good example of this was earlier this year in June, we released episode 26 of the podcast, which was on water rights legislation. We had seen a large movement in California to try to revamp or in some ways gut the water rights system. So we thought it was a really good opportunity for us to talk about not just our rights, our water rights, but also the legislation coming down and the impacts that would have on TID and the water and the power that we serve to our customers. So that's a good example of how we apply not only that importance, but then the timeliness to those topics.
Sure.
And there's a lot of prep and research that goes into these topics and how they get chosen. We have to know a fair amount of the topic going into an interview to be able to talk about the podcast, for you to be able to interview our guests and have a good idea of what they're saying and what questions to ask. So there's a lot of prep and research. There's an outlining process to mark out what key questions or topics we want to make sure that we hit and review with our guests. And then there's a part of it that goes into prepping our guests. Most of our guests are TID employees, and they may not have experience being on microphone like this. So we want them to feel comfortable, know that, we're going to kind of walk them through the process of preparing them with the outline, preparing them in the studio, and kind of helping them make sure that they can speak as naturally about the expertise they have.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's go back for a second to our cozy storage room turned recording studio. Tell us a little bit more about kind of the process by which you, again, in air quotes, built the studio and kind of what your priorities were there in setting us up for the podcast.
So we take a lot of pride in the overall quality of the podcast. There's a lot of ways to record a podcast, some more quickly or easily than others, but you can lose a lot on the quality side depending on which route you go. We wanted TID's podcast to be professional quality, so we converted this, storage room into what we call this cozy recording studio. It's funny to kind of go back and listen to maybe your favorite podcasts, especially in April or May of 2020. A lot of podcasts had moved from professional studios to recording remotely, and they didn't really know what they were doing yet. And the sound quality of those podcasts had dropped significantly. That's why we took the sort of year plus of planning before launching the podcast. We wanted to produce a podcast that, we ourselves want to listen to. Again, both that from that information and entertainment aspect, but also from a quality aspect. A podcast that we feel is, on par with what we believe a TID standard is. So we've used the studio now for all of our episodes of the podcast, but also several media interviews, some other video and audio projects that we've done around the district. So it's come in handy in several different ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. So let's go back to that first episode with Michelle. What was that initial recording process like?
There was a lot of excitement, of course. But we were still learning about kind of what the full recording process looked like. I think I mentioned before, but Constance, you and I had done some test recordings, some mock interviews to make sure everything here, all the sound equipment worked, to make sure you were comfortable behind a microphone interviewing. Mm-hmm. So we knew how to record. I knew how to edit a podcast, but we were still learning kind of all of the efficiencies of the full podcast process and what that looked like from start to finish. But from your perspective, what was that initial interview process like for you?
Like you said, it was exciting. I don't have a background in reporting or interviewing necessarily, or certainly not in producing a podcast. So that was new, but a lot of fun to kind of sort out. And I think having Michelle as our first interview was good because, she's somebody we know, she's familiar. It was a comfortable conversation. But it was also nerve-wracking because she's the general manager. You better not mess this up. But it was important because we were charged with kind of bringing her idea to fruition and wanted to make sure that, we executed that well.
Absolutely. And I think overall, we have a really good first episode of the podcast. A lot of podcasts can have a really rough first episode, especially if you go back to listen back to that episode after listening to some of the more recent episodes of their podcast. They're still finding their voice or the format, maybe some of the bits they have in it if it's a comedy podcast, still working through kind of their process, being comfortable on a microphone before they can kind of settle into that groove of the podcast. I think our prep work and that time we took prior to releasing that first episode really helped us have a first episode that we could be really proud of.
I would agree with that. So you mentioned kind of when podcasts start to find their groove. When do you think the TID Water and Power podcast kind of hit its stride?
Like I said, I'm really proud of our first episode, but I think episode 4 or 5 was really when we started to hit that groove. So episode 4 was released in August of 2021, titled Where Your Power Comes From. This episode is when I feel like, Constance, you really started to kind of find your voice as an interviewer. You were confident in the questions you were asking, and you knew enough about a topic, but then you were also curious about the topics as well to be able to dive further into that. So I think you started to really find your voice that you've kind of still hear now, 28 episodes later.
Well, thanks.
And then episode 5, titled Drought. I think this is when we started to really improve our outline process. We were able to manage content across 2 different guests that we were interviewing separately. And that was a really nice process for us that we've now improved over time and continue to excel at. I also think that episode 5 is when we started to kind of show some of the potential of the podcast. This was September of 2021. We were talking in depth about the drought that we were in. But this was well before the state had formally declared a drought. So this was a good opportunity for us to share our expertise, what we were seeing, how TID operates our water system, and share some of the knowledge and expertise that the district has with our listeners.
To kind of show that TID was a little bit ahead of the curve on what we were seeing.
Absolutely.
Episode 4 was also a very cool experience for me personally because we got to interview Bill Bacca on Where Your Power Comes From right before he retired from the district. And he's one of those people here at TID, had been here a long time and just had such a wealth of knowledge from his time at TID. And I was really glad that we were able to capture some of that on the podcast before he retired. So to be fair, all of the topics that we've covered are important and all of our guests have been fantastic. But I'd like to take a look back on some of our favorite moments that we've had on the podcast. What would you say was your favorite topic that we've discussed on the podcast?
So I'll first mention, because it has to be mentioned, is the Water Rights Podcast, which was episode 7. I feel this is the topic or the episode that always gets brought up when you talk about the TID Water and Power Podcast. Historically, water agencies in California have not talked about their water rights. So for us to, in 2021, kind of open our books and talk in depth about the importance of water rights, what water rights we actually have, are they pre or post 14, what they actually do, what they mean to TID and the community it serves, was a really, really cool topic for us to talk about that we still refer back to all the time.
And as you mentioned, with regard to water rights, that became such an important topic in 2023. And so, yeah, it's been great to have this kind of foundational episode talking about the water rights and what they are, to be able to point back to, whether we're having a conversation with a TID customer or a legislator or whomever it might be. That's been a really, really important resource for us.
Absolutely. And on that resource topic, I'll throw in an honorable mention for kind of favorite topic, which was our hydrological forecasting and modeling episode, episode 12. We talk in depth in this episode with Olivia Kramer and Wes Monnier, 2 of our hydrologists, kind of about all the state-of-the-art technology they use, the state-of-the-art modeling they use to ensure that we are operating Don Pedro, that we're tracking our watershed properly, and making sure that we have proper resources. So that's an episode that I know I refer back to a lot, just like the water rights episode.
Absolutely.
But what about you, Constance? What was your favorite or one of your favorite topics we've covered?
I think for me, it would probably be the episode we did June of 2022 when we had Dr. Alan Patterson on. So Dr. Patterson is a historian who has written several books, but one particularly on the history of TID. And I think for an organization that's 135 years old and owes so much of its current successes to the visionary leaders and founders of the organization so many years ago, I think it's really important and really cool to kind of review some of TID's history with our podcast listeners. So I think that probably ranks as one of my favorite topics.
Absolutely. And Another cool part of that was he was our first outside guest.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'll drop a little teaser here that if you listen to our January 2024 episode, we will have Dr. Patterson back to kind of continue where he left off in the telling of TID's history. So watch out for that one. All right. What would you say was the topic you were most surprised by, how interesting it was, or maybe how well it came across on the podcast?
One episode that comes to mind is the dam safety episode that we did. That was episode 13 in May of 2022. It was released just a few weeks before National Dam Safety Day. But I thought it was a topic that came across very well. Dam safety is incredibly important to our community. But there's a lot of technical terms, a lot of acronyms, but at the guest at the time, Evan Lucas, who's now TID's chief dam safety engineer, was able to explain all of the intricacies, all of the important aspects of dam safety incredibly well. And I think it's very digestible for being such a technical topic.
And I think we're kind of inadvertently hitting on a theme here with our podcast, which truly was one of the goals in starting out, is taking some of these more complex topics and really making them easily understandable for folks who don't live and breathe it every day. And, but still giving them that kind of foundational knowledge about these building blocks of how TID does what we do.
Absolutely. I think the elevator pitch I've often used with the podcast is we get, 280 characters on social media or something, only a couple sentences. You can only say so much, especially about these complex topics that TID deals with day to day.
Sure.
So the podcast is one avenue for us to dive really deep in that. We have some other really cool programs like our Customer Academy or some of the other programs that our shop or other shops have done around the district. But I 100% agree. The podcast has been able to allow us to really dive really deep into these topics that can be complex, but are incredibly important to our customers and our community.
Mm-hmm. I would definitely agree with that.
Constance, sticking with you for a second, do you have a favorite interview by chance? You mentioned some of your favorite topics, but do you have a favorite interview you've done so far?
Ooh, well, I'm not going to pick a favorite child, but I will say that the interviews that I've probably enjoyed the most have been those podcasts in which we've had two guests together at the same time. So as you mentioned, hydrological modeling, we had Olivia and Wes on. We did the irrigation season and operations with Seth Aldrich and Chris Rocha. And then we also did another duet, if you will, on our regulatory process with Austin Avery and Herb Smart. And I just think it's so, like, it just adds another level, right? Because you have like my interaction with the guests, but then you also have the interaction between the two subject matter experts, and they kind of build off of each other's enthusiasm and knowledge. And so I'd have to say that those rank among my favorites.
And I think those are really cool interviews themselves from kind of the outsider perspective as well. Watching you interview and knowing, okay, this guest may be better suited to answer this question, but this guest is going to nail this question. So I think your ability to go back and forth or have them play off each other is really, really cool and really fun and exciting to see during those interviews.
Right on.
Do you have a most surprising interview? I guess a guest who came in and maybe you were surprised at how comfortable they were on microphone.
I would say Chris Harden from Construction and Maintenance, when he did his first episode with us, maintaining TID's systems and facilities. And it's not that I didn't think he would be great, because I had seen Chris present on, other topics in other situations, and he's awesome. But it's one of those situations where the construction and maintenance team doesn't get the spotlight very often. And it was really fun to hear him kind of embrace that and really, maximize that opportunity and talk about his team. And it really showed the passion that he and his team have for the work that they do. So I thought that was a really cool one.
I agree. That was a really fun one.
What would you say has been the most difficult podcast to edit?
That would be episode 2. by far.
You knew that one right
I'm ready to go
away.
on that one. Our guests were great, but I think the key word there is guests, plural, because we decided to have 4 separate interviews and put them all together into 1 hour-and-a-half long episode.
Yeah, whose idea was that?
It was a great topic. It was all things Don Pedro, celebrating the 50th anniversary of Don Pedro. We talked about the history and the water operations, dam safety, hydropower, and recreation. And the episode itself overall turned out very great, and I'm really proud of it. But I feel like I was I had thrusted myself into the fire kind of right out the gates. We'd done a similar format podcast with our 2-part Regulating Reservoir podcast on episode 29. That recording and that editing process was much more smooth and efficient, having the experience of episode 2, but also all the episodes in between.
I know it was a lot of work on your part to edit episode 2, the one that we did for the Don Pedro 50th anniversary, but that was, from the host perspective, that was a really fun one because we got to, kind of dive into such different corners of the Don Pedro project and pull all that together. So that was a fun one. All right. What about some of your other favorite moments on the podcast?
So I'll start with maybe some of the in-studio moments. And this is, I guess, maybe not a specific moment, but kind of a broad moment that we see across episodes. And that's kind of when the guest starts to settle in. So we always do a little bit of initial conversation, a little sound check to make sure all the microphones are working, try to get the guests comfortable in the studio.
Something not necessarily on topic, but just...
Exactly. Maybe what'd you have for lunch that day? But as the interview goes on, you start to see them settle in, and you start to see them know, okay, they're talking about something that they know. Sure. They know this. They live and breathe it every day. So they really start to lean into being that subject matter expert. And that's a really cool thing to see. Kind of the nerves start to settle, and they start to be much more comfortable on microphone, no matter how nervous they were to start.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I guess kind of go along with that is getting feedback from the guests if they've chosen to listen to their episode. Sometimes guests, again, those nerves, they feel like they didn't perform well. Everyone's very critical of themselves. But so oftentimes those guests will go back and listen to the episode once it's been released, once it's gone through the editing process. And they're just really happy with how it turned out. That's really cool for us. One, getting that buy-in from our SMEs around the district, but then just knowing that, we have that trust, and just knowing that they're happy with the end product.
Yeah, definitely.
But then going outside of the studio, it's really cool to hear feedback from listeners. We've received, shout outs from growers at our grower meetings, or from employees around the district who may be learning something new about the district because they work in water, and there's an episode on power. So it's really cool to see that crossover and to get that kind of feedback outside the studio after you release an episode. Because for us, sometimes we finish an episode, we listen to it, we've gone through the editing process, and then we're moving on to the next one. So it's cool to get that feedback from various folks around the district. Speaking
of outside the studio, I'll just share one quick little story. I happened to be in the lobby of our Turlock office one day and struck up a conversation with a customer who had come in. And in the course of conversation, she mentioned how she's a regular listener of the podcast and how she just finds it so informative and she loves listening to it. And then I got really excited and I said, well, I'm Constance. I'm the host of the podcast. And then she got really excited and, we kind of had a nice little moment there. But it was the first time I think that someone outside the organization, I had heard someone outside the organization like directly say to me, hey, I'm a listener and it's cool. I like what you're doing. So that was a really cool moment for me. So Kathy P., if you're listening, thanks so much for that interaction. And I hope you're still a regular listener with us.
So we've mentioned it before, but there's a lot of research and prep that goes into each one of these episodes. Which was the toughest topic for you to wrap your head around?
I would say relicensing. A lot of that process had happened before I ever even got to the district. And it's such a nuanced topic with so many different variables. I felt like I needed to make sure that I had a good background on the subject in order to conduct an educated interview with Michael Cook. I would also say it's a runner-up to that one would be when we had Dan Severson on to talk about the TID's participation in the energy imbalance market or EIM and talk about our summer readiness. Again, it's one of those topics that there are so many variables that are tracked and planned and coordinated by so many different departments across TID, whose efforts kind of all have to align to make sure TID is well positioned to get through those hot summer days where our demand is the greatest. And so I felt like that was something that I really kind of had to put those puzzle pieces together for myself first before I would be able to conduct an interview on it. How about you?
So 2 episodes that come to mind. We actually released them back to back, but cybersecurity and then the Power Control Center. So these were so interesting because they're such they're topics or I guess areas of the district that most people just don't know that it's happening.
Sure.
But they are ensuring that that we are secure, that we have water running, we have power on consistently. And with both cybersecurity and the Power Control Center, there's so many kind of security factors along with not just being able to communicate this topic on the podcast properly, but to do so securely without kind of giving up any industry secrets that may be harmful to the district. So that was a really interesting balance of what we talk about, how we talk about it. For me, it was just a really great understanding of kind of both those areas of the district and kind of their importance of the district.
Yeah, totally. So we are always looking to keep the podcast fresh and interesting. And in honor of our 135th anniversary, we explored a slightly different option with the podcast, in addition to our monthly episode that was released. And that was the addition of TID Short Stories. Tell our listeners what the Short Stories series is and how it came to be.
Yeah, so the original idea for the TID Short Stories was going to be a single episode on the podcast. Again, it was for our 130th anniversary, so we thought it'd be cool to tell some of these either stories that we've heard kind of passed down from employee to employee, or some of the unique stories from our 100-year book written by Dr. Alan Patterson. But we were going to put all those kind of mini stories into one episode. However, as we were building out these stories and topics, the idea started to evolve into this 10-part miniseries. So it's, unique. It tells kind of these lesser known, unique stories of TID's history in kind of these 10 to 15 minute episodes, each narrated by a different TID employee. These episodes were very unique to what our typical monthly episode is. It was unique in the amount of prep work that went into these episodes. So these were really research intensive to make sure they were historically accurate, to make sure that all the important players were involved in these stories. There was a full script drafted, and then just a very different type of editing from my perspective for this narrative podcast versus this interview podcast. And I'm actually really excited that the TID Short Stories received awards from both the Northwest Public Power Association and the American Public Power Association communication conferences earlier this year.
That is very exciting. And it's a great lead into the success that we've seen from the podcast so far. So in addition to those 2 awards that you just mentioned, we recently hit a big milestone with the podcast. Tell us about that.
We did. We recently reached 10,000 downloads. So we reached this just after our 31st episode release. So really across our first 30 episodes plus the short stories, we hit that first kind of 10,000 download milestone.
That's a big deal. That's exciting.
It is, yeah. And we had certain goals in mind when we first released this podcast, goals which we have had to increase and strive for new goals because it's done, it's exceeded our expectations, at least to start of this first 2.5 years. But some of our top episodes in that 10,000 are Project Nexus, the Solar Over Canals project, which has received coverage nationally. The Power Control Center, which I mentioned earlier, is one of those more difficult to understand topics. Irrigation season operations, the first episode with Michelle Reimers, and of course, water rights. Those are kind of our top 5 episodes in no particular order. But it's also been fun because there's been somewhat of a competition internally about downloads. So a little soft jabbing from employee to employee about kind of the more popular episodes.
Once our guests have listened to their episode and they are feeling good about it, then there might be a little friendly competition.
Absolutely. But some of the other cool metrics that we've seen from the podcast, each of our episodes are typically in the top 25% of all podcasts for downloads in the first week of release. So we're getting that initial download, regular listeners listening as soon as the episode comes out, that second Wednesday of the month. And then we've now kind of TID has become a subject matter expert for podcasts in the utility industry.
Sure.
We've been featured on panels at the Northwest Public Power Association, at the Association of California Water Agency conferences. We've written magazine articles for utility magazines. We've been interviewed for online articles or print articles regarding how to produce a podcast, what goes into it, and all of TID's efforts in this space.
And what about any other metrics? Talking about, we hit 10,000 downloads. Where are those downloads coming from?
So largely from the United States and largely from our service area. About 54% of downloads are in our service area, with a large download just outside. Think of like Sacramento. Or very unique or very surprising for us to see is we've actually had downloads in 67 different countries or territories around the world.
Yeah.
So we have a kind of large, steady listenership in Germany somehow. And then we also have steady listeners in Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Nevada. So kind of a worldwide sensation, you can call it.
So shout out to our nationwide and even international listeners.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us. All right. So you mentioned that we have hit a lot of the goals that we had for the podcast. So just kind of a quick review. When we started out, some of the goals that we had kind of set for ourselves, we wanted to educate TID customers on our operations. We wanted to promote TID programs, events, and news, increase awareness of TID as a community-owned utility, and increase awareness of TID as an industry leader on water and power topics. How would you say we've stacked up against those goals so far?
I think we've nailed them so far. There were a lot of unknowns going into this process. How the podcast would be received, how the work each month would be measured out. And I think it's blown away our initial goals. We've seen success of the podcast both quantitatively and qualitatively. So we've shared some of the numbers as far as downloads or downloads within the first week. But a lot of that feedback we receive from customers, whether it be online or in person, has been incredible. It's always awesome to hear from our employees as well, like I mentioned, hearing them learn about areas outside of their own that they're now becoming interested in. And I think overall, it's been a very big success, and we're excited to keep this going into the next year.
All right. So then what will the 2024 season of the TID Water and Power Podcast look like?
So as I mentioned before, we're in the process of kind of planning out what 2024 looks like, but we already have some excited episodes, already on the schedule. So Constance, you teased it earlier, but January, we'll have Dr. Alan Patterson back on the podcast to kind of continue the next part of kind of TID's history. And then from there, we're just excited to continue to see the evolution of the podcast month over month.
All right. Well, Brandon, thank you for stepping out from behind the soundboard to give our listeners a look at what goes into creating the TID Water and Power Podcast.
Thank you. Happy to kind of give some insight behind the scenes, and happy to talk a little bit more about the podcast, just you and I, and now to get to share it out with our listeners.
Perfect. Thank you for tuning in to the TID Water and Power Podcast. You can find TID on Facebook at facebook.com/TurlockID, on Instagram and Twitter at TurlockID, and on LinkedIn as the Turlock Irrigation District. I'm your host, Constance Anderson. We'll see you again next time.